Hi everybody, welcome to this panel discussion on the impressive rise of French tech in the European ecosystem. So my name is Anne-Charlotte, I'm a growth equity investor at Eurazeo Growth. Eurazeo is a global investment platform with more than $35 billion assets under management and 12 offices globally. So we focus on investing in tech companies in Europe and in the US. We invest from Series B to IPOs, and that's basically checks between $20 million to $200 million. So I spend most of my time on France and Spain, and I've been lucky to support some of the most successful startups in both countries, such as Doctolib in France and Glovo and Divo in Spain. So we're here today to speak about the French market, and I'm very happy to do so today as I witnessed its evolution since I started as an investor back in 2017. So of course I'm a bit biased, right, because I'm French. But if you look at the numbers, France became, for the first time in 2022, the second largest tech hub in Europe, ahead of Germany and behind the UK. So we're here today to explore the factors that contributed to this success, as well as opportunities to collaborate with Spain. And for this, I'm delighted to share the stage with Olivier, that I know very well, who is the founder and CEO of Aircall. Olivier is French. He then relocated to the US and is now based in Madrid, so quite an interesting journey. Olivier, over to you for the introduction.
Hello, everyone. So I'm indeed French, but my heart is split between France and Spain. I came to Spain first in 2008, and I was working in the steel industry. So I was just running factories. I felt that was a fun thing to do. So then big jump in tech and started Aircall in 2013 with my co-founders in Paris. Then moved 5 years in New York to build the US operations at Aircall, and came back about 18 months ago to my country of heart, Madrid and Spain.
Amazing. So now let's start with the first question. So Olivier, you decided to start your company in France, and then you moved to the US. What did France bring you as an ecosystem when you started your company, and why did you decide to move to the US after?
Okay, so the first thing you need, if you want to start a software company, you need tech and you need kind of biz dev, right? So what I found in France when we started Aircall is there was really great tech talent, and it's always the same story. Like entrepreneurship is about connections, and you just meet a bunch of people. Actually, I almost started a company in Madrid with the founder of Parclick, who's a very successful entrepreneur here in Madrid, and finally went the other way and teamed up with my co-founders in Paris. And that was good to get started, because what was existing in Paris and France at the time was really great engineering, so great talent there. Of course, the market was a bit small, so very early on we had a global vision for Aircall. We wanted to build a global company. So like we started selling to the West Coast, like all over the US as well in Europe. But I think in the first few years, maybe 25% of our customers were American already. Because the market was just too small. This has changed a lot now, right? And so as we got the traction from the US, then we raised some money, and it became very clear that if we want to become a global leader in this industry, we have to win in the US. That's why I moved to New York with the ambition like to bring a founder close to the US market, and we learned a ton. It's the most competitive market in the world. It's really tough. So it helps you just stretch yourself, be more ambitious, and it has helped us as well win in Europe. So that's why I went to the US.
Understood. And I've met you in New York a couple of years ago, and the office was great, and also the atmosphere, I think, was really ambitious, and a lot of energy in your office, so that's great to hear. Maybe the second question for you is, so you came back to Europe, and as you know well France, could you give us maybe your view on what major changes happened in France since you came back?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, we want to talk about France, we want to talk about, I think, Europe as a whole and Spain in particular. I think France was a bit similar to Spain now, right? So I think what I've seen changing is, okay, you had great engineering talents, but you didn't have a lot of large-scale software businesses. And this has changed, right? Now you have huge companies in France. You have the Doctolibs, like multi-decacorns, you got it, right? Multi-billion-dollar valuations. You have Content Square. You have really big companies, and so this has changed. The funding market has changed. At the time, you had some investors, like you had the family, if you remember. There was Schema Ventures, great to get started. But then if you want to scale, you have to go to the US. And I think what I've seen changing in France is that funds like Eurazeo and others that just bring you the power if you want to really execute. And I see a lot of parallels with Spain, where there's a lot of entrepreneurship spirit, great engineering talent, some funding, maybe some late stage funding still to be improved. I don't know what you think, by the way.
Yeah, I share your enthusiasm about the French tech market. And I think one number that illustrates well the shift from a startup to a scale-up ecosystem is the number of unicorns. So back in 2020, we had about 10 unicorns in France. Today, it's more than 30. So two things from my point of view that changed, that made this happen. First, the access to gross equity capital, as you said, and second, also a shift in the mindset of the entrepreneurs we are meeting. About the first point, so 10 years ago, when you wanted to raise more than $100 million in Europe, it was quite impossible, right? You needed to raise with US investors. What happened over the past few years is that we saw the emergence of local growth funds, especially in France, and thanks to some government initiatives, such as the TB program that has been pushed in France to help us raise money as growth investors. At Eurazeo, I think we've been quite a pioneer in this regard. We launched the fund back in 2015, and we are now the largest gross equity capital fund in Europe. And the second point about the ambition of entrepreneurs, I think today entrepreneurs that we are meeting, they are not only focusing on building successful companies, but also international companies, leaders in their market globally, and especially thanks to M&A. A good example of that actually is Content Square in our portfolio that you mentioned earlier. So Content Square back in 2019, it was a very European company. And what they did back then is that they had this huge US competitor in which was named ClickTale, and the two companies were about the same size. Content Square decided to buy ClickTale back in 2019, which was quite a risky operation, right? Because Content Square was really European, ClickTale was 100% US, and so it was risky in terms of integration and overall M&A operation. So I think this is a great showcase of the ambition that the entrepreneurs have today to really build category leaders in their markets. And maybe just to finish on this point, I think there is something that we still miss in France to create this kind of very strong and virtuous ecosystem. And this is the lack of significant exits. If you look at the market, the IPO market in tech in Europe versus the US, it's very different, right? In terms of number of IPOs, but also in terms of the value of the IPOs. If you compare over the past few years, the aggregated value of market cap when it comes to tech IPOs in the US, it's 11 times bigger than in Europe. So there is something we have to do here. And on our side, we decided to launch an IPO strategy last year to make this change and to really create the tech IPO market in France and in Europe. And so maybe a question for you, Olivier, in this regard. Your company is quite sizable right now. You've been super successful. Now it's a very international company. A large chunk of the revenue comes from the US. How do you think about your exit strategy? And would you say that being French, or at least having a lot of French people at Aircall, is an advantage or a disadvantage when it comes to exits?
Okay, yeah, it's kind of two different questions. We're still on a strategy to create a long-term independent company, right? So we feel there's a space to take. Today we're kind of north of 100 million, getting to 150 million AR, which is relatively big for software, but we feel we could double that and double again, and really become like part of the industry of communication, become a global leader. So the logical exit strategy is to IPO. And it's fair that we're really thinking the IPO in the US, because the valuations you get in Europe, the depth of the market, the reference, not really relevant. And again, the US is our biggest market. We do 35% of the revenue in the US, so it's really doable. So that's the main exit strategy. Now, there's of course another one, which is get acquired. And that's possible because the biggest players in the world are US-based or American. Like we all know the Zoom, Microsoft with Teams, I mean all those guys, right? Slack, Salesforce. So that could happen. In that case, although that's a minority scenario, in that case probably we would end up as part of a US group. And to your second question, which is that an asset to be French or European? I mean, we see ourselves as more European, right? Because we have the main office is in France. We have an office in Madrid with like about 100 people. We have an office in London and an office in Berlin, right? And then of course in Asia. I think it can be interesting, especially if you do not become public. If you become public, it's like the US mindset is a bit different, right? It's a different game. If you do an M&A deal and you get acquired, then of course some US competitors would really value the fact that we have a knowledge of the European ecosystem. We're across all Europe. Europe is complex, and we know to manage this complexity. Many US players are just afraid of the language differences, the cultural differences, the regulation differences that exist between countries.
Yeah, this is also something that we saw. I mean, we sold Tink, which was the biggest exit in fintech at $2 billion back in 2021. And obviously the cultural difference, as well as, all the regulation about employment in Europe is a bit scary for a US buyer. But yeah, I agree with your point. And maybe to come back to our topic of discussion, right, we wanted to speak about French, obviously, but also Spain, as we saw a lot of the similar trends that are happening in France right now in Spain. For example, in Spain today, we do have about 10 unicorns, I think. So it's like 3 years behind France, but a lot of growth is happening within the ecosystem. What's your view, since you just recently relocated to Madrid? What's your view on the major changes that are happening in Spain right now?
So I think, and again, I've been in Spain, came to Spain in 2008, and I came to Madrid. I mean, Spain is, at the time we were saying Spain is different, right? But Spain has always been centered around Madrid and Barcelona. You have other great hubs, but Barcelona as well, much more tech, etc. Madrid, much more castizo, no? A bit more traditional, and etc. It's clear that the whole country is changing, and Madrid specifically is changing really fast. I think what is becoming very clear, for me, first, the engineering quality is really high. Again, at Aircall, we have an office of about 100 engineers, and the level, the quality of the people is pretty amazing. Like, really, we feel we're very proud of ourselves in France. We feel in France we have great engineering, and we do, I think, but Spain is really at par or even better in some areas. And they're very adaptive, so that's great. I think what has been missing maybe historically is somewhat the some ambition, right? So, Spain is a small market. So, and you have to think beyond the borders. You have to not be afraid to compete with the rest of Europe and with the world. And historically, let's say 5-10 years ago, it was like, okay, if we do something in Spain, it's already good. And worst case, we'll go to LATAM. LATAM is just, it's tough markets. Now, I see more and more what I see is people who say, fine, we'll do Spain as a stepstone to then attack Europe or go to the US. And it's really more a CEO, actually, more than engineering. It's really a CEO ambition and let's say, removing the mental barriers, I think, that have existed. What I've seen changing is as well the relationship to software. When I started 9 years ago, there wasn't that much love for software. There was a bit like, I could hear from talking to people in Spain, like, okay, software is a little bit of a scam, right? It's a little bit like, real estate, that's real. Banking, that's serious. Okay. Industry. And I think what has changed in France is this love for software. Like, software really changes the world. Software solves real problems. I mean, we see that every day. And I think there's this love for software that goes along with the ambition and saying, the beauty of software is you can scale it infinitely across the whole world. And once you realize that, then you start thinking bigger. So I think I see a lot of parallels. I see more and more Spanish entrepreneurs going to Y Combinator. It was not really the case 5-10 years ago. Exactly the parallel with Paris, where Maybe 10, 15 years ago, nobody would go there, and then at some point, everybody wanted to apply to Y Combinator, right? And so I think the path is going to be pretty, or could be very similar if everybody else. So if we have exits, as you say, if the VCs are ready to take the risk to make big bets, etc.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think we share your view. I mean, we spend a lot of time in Spain with the team. And about the talents, actually, we also see some of our portfolio companies based in France, but building tech hub in Spain because they do see a lot of great talents there. So 2 examples of that are Payfit and Mano Mano, who have a lot of tech people in Spain, actually. The second point about the ambition of entrepreneurs, I do agree with you that I was pretty positively surprised by the fact that Spanish entrepreneurs, they start in Spain, they find their product market fit, and then in terms of the second market they choose US or Latin America. I'm not super sure I agree with your assessment of Latin America because yes, it's a complex market, but it's a big market, underserved. So I think with software we can do something very big here, also in the payment industry. But if we look at their ambition to expand very quickly, this is something we don't see so much in France or Germany, for example, where companies prefer to extend in one other European country first before going to the US. So I share your view on that point. And maybe just to finish on Spain, on our side, we're super excited to see this new wave of early stage companies. We see a lot of a great local VC funds, so Kibo, Seaya, K-Fund, just to name a few. And we do believe that they will also follow the same path that we see in France, meaning creating also growth equity capital funds locally. And we do know that some of them are thinking about that today, so this is great for the ecosystem. And I think, if we think further, right, so France, Spain, they are following the same path, they are growing well, the ecosystem are great. But if you think about how we can compete against the US tech market, we have to think as Europe as one ecosystem, right? So on our side at Eurazeo, we like to think that Europe can be one ecosystem, and I think we can create a lot of synergy between all the countries to make it happen. So maybe the last question for you, Olivier, because I'm sure we have a lot of entrepreneurs in this audience today. What would be your advice for an entrepreneur that wants to launch his or her company in terms of country, right? Is it better today to launch your company in Europe, or is it better to launch your company in the US?
So the first thing, if you start your company, the one big thing is the founding team first. So wherever your founders are, that's where you should get started, right? So let's assume your co-founders and yourself, you're in Europe. I think what has changed is Europe has become a huge market for software. As I said, when we started Aircall, there was low adoption of our technologies. I mean, the market was not so much ready, so we used the US to just get some traction. And then the market matured over the past 5 to 10 years. But now it's different. So the European markets, you take any verticals, most of them are very, very big, right? Even if you do vertical SaaS, it's very, very big. And so you don't have to go to the US. You can build huge company, huge successes, just focusing on Europe as a market. Now the one thing is really thinking as Europe as a market, not thinking, okay, I'm going to stay in Spain, I'm going to stay in France. So that's one. Now, what is true as well is if you want to build a global leader, and that's the ambition for your own company, you can't avoid the US. So you have to go. Nobody builds a global leader in software without winning in the US, which means without going to the US, so having some of the founders going to the US, because that's still the biggest market in the world and the leading market, the most competitive. So it's like what we say in New York. If you make it in New York, you make it everywhere, right? But it's the same thing here. If you make it in the US, you'll make it everywhere. Which is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with your point. All our enterprise software companies do have the CEO based in the US, or at least for some years, just to establish the team, right, and the brand. But then when it comes to SMB software, for example, Doctolib is very much in Europe today, Conto as well. So it depends also on your market, right? But I do agree with you that for enterprise software, your market is really in the US, so you need to have a very strong management team there. So I think we're at the end of the time we had today. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you so much, Olivier, for taking the time and for all the insights. And yeah, let's hope that we can make France and Spain better in the next few years.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you all.